I thank you very much for inviting me and for this possibility to talk to the Cyberemotion group. I feel just delighted of this opportunity, and you will understand why. So the topic is the social sharing of emotion. Can I borrow this from you?
The plug is
It's on? Yeah.
You have to
put it, yeah.
And it has to be on the side. Let's see. It should be on. Try.
Yeah. Here is the traditional view of emotions, the conception of emotion upon which during a century psychologists have been working around. And it's a view of emotion as a very short process. So you have an emotion eliciting situation, and as Arvid just told us, many changes going on in that situation. And the purpose of those changes would be just to modify the situation so that the emotion eliciting situation would disappear and the person could go back to the homeostatic balance. So going back to the initial state, it's the homeostatic view of emotion. It was largely inspired by studies on animal behavior. When it comes to human beings, there is something which has been largely ignored by psychologists when investigating emotion. It's what's going on after. And after the fact, there is something very important which was neglected by psychologists, and that was the topic of my work. It's the social sharing of emotion. What does that mean? It's the fact that after an emotional experience, people talk about it. They do so recurrently, which means that for a given emotional episode, they will talk several times about it. They do so most of the time to people around them, I mean their intimates. We will come back to that. They do so in the house following the emotion, also in the days following, sometimes the weeks. When it's very important, it can go on for months, even for years, and sometimes for the entire life for a single important episode. It is observed in 80 to 100% of emotional episodes, which means that it's a phenomenon of extreme generality. It's really a part of emotional manifestation. And it's observed irrespective of emotional valence. Positive emotion and negative emotion are shared as often. Irrespective of gender, whatever the stereotypes we have in this regard, males and females do share emotion in the same manner. Whatever the education, you don't need to be a much educated, much verbal person to share your emotion. And whatever the culture, we have been investigating this process on all the continents, and it's observed everywhere. There are a lot of variation according to cultures, but the fact of sharing emotion is observed really everywhere. So something very important, the more intense the emotion, the more it will be shared. To more person, more often, more repetition, more extensively. There is a very high correlation between the two variables. Here are a couple of illustrations of longitudinal observation on people. The first example, if people recently bereaved, they've been losing some important person to whom they were attached. And when you explore their social sharing after 10 days, you ask them whether in the last 2 days they've been still sharing about this episode, you see that virtually everybody has been sharing. And then 1 month later, you see that's still very important. 3 months later, still nearly 80% of people do share about that. Here, another example, recent delivery by young mothers who were delivered their first children. And they are asked how far they did talk about the emotion they've been feeling during the delivery. And you can see that after 1 week, virtually everybody does. And you can follow up them, and then you see that after 5 weeks, there is an extension, but still, most of a good number of mothers still talk about that. But you can see that the scale is different. Here we are in months, because it's a very important episode. Here we are in weeks, and because it's a less important episode. First dissection by medical students on human bodies. So it's very heavily loaded emotional experience. You can see, follow them up 1 week after everybody has been talking or so, 2 weeks later still, and 3 weeks later still 71% of participants do talk about their this new experience. And those are psychology students, and it's their most important exam at the first time they are undergoing exam at the university. The most important exam is a general psychology class, and I am the teacher. So you can see that after 1 week, all of them do speak. After 2 weeks, still virtually all of them. After 3 weeks, we already have a nice extension, but still 50% of the students are still preoccupied with this episode. Here are diary data. They are collected every night. Participants are asked to complete a diary book in which they report the most important episode of the day, most important emotion. Then after that, we can classify the episode according to the type of emotion involved. And they are asked, among others, did they talk about this episode once it happened during that day? And you can see that about 60%, and this is a quite classic observation, you find this in every studies on diary observation, 60% of the episodes are shared on the day they happened. So social sharing is something which starts early after the episode. There is one exception. It's when shame is involved. Shame is a typical example of an emotion which brings difficulties with social sharing. And it's the case for shame, it's the case for guilt, and that's about it. Okay? Why do people share emotion? So it's interesting to observe that people share positive emotion and negative emotion at about the same level, but the motives why they do so are totally different. And for what regards positive emotion, now we have a very good idea of the motives behind sharing of positive emotion. It was proposed by an American colleague in '94, the concept of capitalization. And this colleague proposed that an emotional episode of a positive kind is a capital. And every time we would talk about it, every time you would recall this capital, you would get interest, benefits from it. So it means that you are going to increase your positive affectivity by the very fact of talking or recalling the positive episode. So it's useful to be able to go back to a positive episode because it's going to put you in a good mood. And so the conclusion is that positive emotion sharing of positive emotion enhances the sender's level of positive affect. Since this proposition was done, many investigations have been developed around this concept. There are really a lot of publications up until very recently. And one of them was interesting in the fact that it's open to the effect of sharing positive emotion in couples. The study showed that when partners are responsive, which means that when I'm sharing, for instance, positive emotion with my spouse, if my spouse responds positively and supports me in this dialogue, this is going to enhance the quality of our relationship. And in the long term, couples who have developed this habit of exchanging positive experiences have a higher level of intimacy, higher levels of satisfaction, and probably also a higher longevity of couple life. Now, what about negative emotions? Here is a study in which we compare positive emotional events and negative emotional events. People are asked to retrieve from their memory recent positive or negative emotional episodes, and they are given scales with motives. They are given 9 motives, and they can rate the various motives so that you could compare the motives endorsed for positive emotion and for negative emotion. And in gray, we have the motives which are discriminative for negative events, and in pink, we have those which are really discriminative for positive events, and there are a couple of motives which do not discriminate the two events. You can see that for positive events, the discriminative motifs are recalling, getting attention, informing. And this is really in line with capitalization. It really fits the concept of capitalization. For negative emotion, the important one is venting. People believe that once they would talk about their emotion, they would evacuate the emotion, and so they would delete the emotional experience. It's totally wrong. It's a representation which exists in most of cultures, but the investigation of the consequences of sharing an emotion disconfirm this fact. Things are much more complicated than that. Mere sharing is not enough to transform an emotional experience. So it's more complicated. But other motives are understanding, getting bonding, and getting social support. And behind this, there are two very important motives for sharing negative emotion. It's finding meaning, because negative emotional experiences are often the experience of some loss of meaning, and people try to understand what happened. And the other motive is going back to other people, establishing bonding, entering in a socially supporting relationship, because most of the time when people go through a negative emotion, their very first reaction, their very first response is a very big feeling of loneliness. They feel lonely and they want to go back to, most often, what they consider are their attachment figures, people they trust and people to whom they are able to share what happened. So, to whom do they share their emotions? If you take children, at a young age, here they are age 8 to 12, and they've been participating to a night game at a scout camp, and at that night game they've been experiencing a number of scary emotions because everything is organized so that they would have some experience of fear. And we investigate here how often in the week after they talk to a number of figures. And you can see that people who are the target of their social sharing are essentially father and mother. Other people enter into the picture, but at a much lower level. Then if you move on in age groups and you take adolescents, you compare males and females, you find virtually no difference between males and females for what regards target. And you can see that the major target is family members. Family members, it's essentially father and mother, as is the case for younger children. They still have a number of elective friends to whom they share, but it's less important than the family. And then other people do not exist in the sharing situation. No foreign person is involved. And those young people have already some girlfriend or boyfriend, but this girlfriend and boyfriend are not yet partners for social sharing. They do not have the status, social status needed to become a partner of social sharing. If you take younger adult, then you have a number of changes. There are slight differences between male and female, but it's not that important. The important thing is that now social sharing is distributed virtually equally across 3 different groups. First, family, which has been decreasing its importance compared to the former graph. Next, friends. And then another group is coming to the floor, it's partners, which are now, like spouses, fiancés, and so on, which are now having a status important in social sharing. And then if you move to adulthood, mature adult, then very big differences occur between male and females. Females are in pink and males in blue. And you can see that the more important figure is the partner, with the difference that males do share virtually everything on the back of their spouse, which is certainly not the case of females. So big difference regarding gender. I used to say that men tend to disclose their emotion to people to whom they want to show them naked. So, and you can see that it's not the case for females, because females still keep a number of, they do not put all their eggs in the same basket, so they share their emotion with a variety of people. But all in all, you can see that it's close people, it's intimates. There is one exception. It's the case when you go to an emotional experience of a specific type, like for instance, something which is happening in your profession. Then you would turn first to other professionals, to people close to you in your profession. And another example is when you experience something very particular, like a very important disease. I have a good example of this case. Here it's a larger sample of chronic patients, and they are asked their social sharing target and satisfaction of the target. And you can see that family members come here quite later in the process, and the most important people are first another patient having the same type of disease, then psychologist, then the specialist, the consultant doctor, then the physiotherapist, then the best friend, then the family doctor. So you can see that there are some cases where the intimates do play a secondary role compared to the usual situation. What about social sharing listeners now? A first observation on the side of listeners, when you monitor the emotion they experience when they listen to some sharing situation. Here we have 121 listeners, and they've been rating emotion scales, 10 basic emotion scales. And you can see that there are a whole lot of variety of emotion coming to the floor because they've been listening to a variety of situations. But there is one thing upon which there is a fantastic consensus. It's a scale from 0 to 7, which means that the average is close to the peak of the scale, the maximum of the scale. It's interest. Listening to emotion of other people is something which interests human beings. And probably if there wouldn't be this disposition, we wouldn't have news, we wouldn't have novels, we wouldn't have movies, we wouldn't have theater, and so on, because in all this situation, part of the fascination comes from the fact that we listen to stories about emotion happening to other people. So that's the first observation. Another observation is that overall, when you rate the emotional status, the emotional feelings of the person who is listening to an emotion, it varies with the intensity of the emotion of the episode which was shared. We have here comparison of low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity episode, and you can see that the intensity of on a 10-point scale, the intensity of the emotion of the listeners is highly correlated to the intensity of the episode heard. So listening to an emotion is eliciting an emotion in the listener. That's a very important observation. Now, what do the listeners do? We have here an investigation in which we compared again low intensity sharing of emotion, medium intensity emotion shared, and high intensity emotion shared. And we have been assessing a whole lot of behavior, and we have been grouping them in terms of listener responses in two categories: verbal manifestation and non-verbal manifestation. And you can see that verbal manifestation, the more the emotion is intense, the more it decreases, which means that once you listen to a high-intensity emotion, you stop speaking, you stop verbalizing. And then when you monitor the reverse, non-verbal manifestation, you can see that there is a sharp increase of non-verbal manifestation with the intensity of emotion. What do non-verbal manifestation means? It's watching the other person into the eyes, coming closer to the person, touching the person, eventually taking the person into the arms, and so on and so on. It's attachment behavior. When we listen to high-intensity emotion, we go close to the person and we develop this very bizarre behavior that human beings are able to develop in emotional situation. Attachment behavior, coming close and appeasing the other by using one's behavior. So then we can summarize the dynamics going on in an emotional situation. Here we have on the left side a person A who has been experiencing an emotion and who then is in need of sharing this emotion. So this person expresses emotion to a target person B, who is often an intimate, and this person B is going to experience interest. The interest is going to stimulate the emotional expression so that A is going to express more and B is going to experience emotion in response to this expression. And this is going to develop between these two people more and more a feeling of unity, mutual empathy, perceived similarity. We are feeling the same thing the more we go. And then this is going to stimulate person B in developing understanding and willingness to help, pro-social behaviors. And so this person is going to receive these benefits, understanding, help, and support. The more you receive this, the more you are going to like person B, even if it's a person you already like. And there are many studies in social psychology demonstrating that if you develop pro-social behavior towards someone, you are going to like this person more too. Which means that these two persons, at the end of the social sharing situation, are brought together in a closer way. This is really, this is something which is fantastically documented. There are hundreds of empirical studies demonstrated that once you talk about your emotion to someone else, you are going to be closer to that person. So it's a process of refreshing of social links. Propagation of the social sharing of emotion. Here is the concept of secondary social sharing. It's a syllogism. If emotions are socially shared, and I tried to show you that's the case, and if sharing targets experience emotion when listening, I tried to show you that this is the case, then conclusion is that targets should share what they heard with other people. Here is a study demonstrating things that have been replicated a couple of times since then. Low intensity emotion, medium intensity emotion, high intensity emotion, which are shared. And we are here the rate of secondary social sharing, which means how often and for many times the person that's been listening the low, medium, or high intensity emotion has been talking to another person afterwards of what this person has been hearing in the initial sharing situation. You can see that secondary social sharing is a reality. Now, would there be something like tertiary social sharing, which means that a person in a secondary sharing listening situation, would this person go to some D person afterwards? We have only a few data on this question, but it shows that it's the case. Here we have person C asked whether they would share to some person D, and in 1/3 of the case they do not. But in 1/3 of the case they would with some person D, one, and in 1/3 of the case they would with several person D, which means that in 2/3 of the case, tertiary social sharing is a reality. Which means that you can represent social sharing situation in this way. This person in red has been experiencing some relatively important emotional situation, and then the social sharing goes on. In the first circle, primary social sharing. In the second circle, secondary social sharing. In the third circle, tertiary social sharing. Which means that in a couple of hours, many people are going to be informed of what was going on in the experience of the person represented there in red. Now, it's of course not easy to empirically investigate such a process. An American colleague called Kent Harber, who is one of his students, has been taking this for granted and wanted to verify how far the propagation is going on. And he is, in particular, a professor of psychology in a department of law, and he's giving a class on psychology and law, and he's having 33 students in this class. And every year he's bringing the students to a number of visits. They go to visit the police office, they go to visit a jail, they will go to visit a hospital, and in particular at some visit they go and visit the hospital morgue, which is of course a negative emotional experience. And on the day it happened, the day after the day it happened, the second day, he asked his students to whom they did talk about their experience of a visit of the morgue. And on 97% of the students did talk about it, and at an average of 6.2 times per student, and they contacted in this sharing, this primary sharing situation, 205 other persons. And then the professor asked his students to recontact all the 205 persons and to ask them to whom they did share this episode. And he could obtain the data for most of the students. The secondary sharing happened for 1.4, 1.5%, 1.5 opportunities, and 299 persons were recontacted, so that's the second day. And then he asked the student to be in touch with the 299 persons and to monitor how often this person have been involved in tertiary sharing, could observe for the students for whom he could collect the data, which is not the case for all of them. 377 persons were involved in tertiary sharing, which means that all in all, in 3 days, nearly 900 persons have been contacted and knew about the experience of the morgue. Now, this brings me to talk a little bit about collective emotional events. So when something strikes a group, a collectivity, a community, all people at a time, as is the case with the episodes you see depicted here. Here is a set of pictures I'm really loving. It's a French photographer. A couple of days after the 2001 World Trade Center attacks in New York, he went with his camera on the site, and he just took shots of the faces of people who came to the place and just wanted to see the place where all this happened. And here is the face of those people. And there are hundreds of pictures of that type. I took just a sample. And they are in what I love calling a state of emotional fascination, because emotional episode fascinates us And you can see on their face, but that's at least my interpretation, they are just fascinated, lost in a dream in a sense. Do you remember what you were doing when you heard about this? Do you have a memory of what you were doing when you first heard? There are abundant demonstrations that when something of the like happens, when the media are displaying some information about an important emotional episode, people keep a very clear memory of what they were doing when they first heard this news. That's called in psychology flashbulb memory, because it's the idea that you take a flash picture of what happens when you hear about this. And there is now a good model which has been developed by people in my group, a good model of how things of that type develop. And it's a question of the intensity of the emotion experienced by people when they hear the news. The more intense the emotion, the more extent would be the rehearsal of this episode. And the rehearsal is composed of 3 elements. First element is reading the media. Once people listen to such a news, they go back to the media and they listen to the media and they read the media abundantly. A second factor feeding the extent of rehearsal is repetitive thought. Once you witness such an episode, you start thinking about it again and again, and it comes back in your memory, in your mind, even if you don't want to. And the third factor is social sharing, because of course this type of episodes are extensively shared. The 3 together are feeding extent of rehearsal, and the extent of rehearsal is going to feed the memory of the event and the memory of what you were doing during this event, because it's impossible to disentangle for a listener the moment and what happened, what was happening when they were listening from the real facts regarding the episode which was displayed by the news. 1 hour observation of exchange of tweets and retweets, tweets from Japan when the earthquake happened in March 2011. This 1 hour of exchange. You can see the density across the planet of social sharing regarding this dramatic episode. So it's in real time. And here is the rationale behind, at least the proposal for rationale. When something of that kind happens, everyone is sharing repetitively because everyone is struck by intense emotion, and then everybody is talking about this emotion with people around. But at the same time, everyone is also a sharing target because other people have the same motive around them, and so they are constantly exposed to the sharing from other person. So every sharing round is eliciting first emotional reactivation in the sender. Every time you're listening to emotion, you feel emotions again. And if you feel emotion, you are again motivated to talk about it. So it happens in the receiver, in the sender, but it also happens in the receiver, which means that in both persons, reactivation of the need to share is reactivated constantly. And so the social sharing for this type of event in the community can easily, quickly reach astronomical values. It's like in a nuclear reactor. It goes very fast. Of course, in a nuclear reactor, they have tools to restrict, to inhibit the process. What's going on in the psychosocial process? There is one tool which is inhibiting the process. It's the only one existing, and that's probably the only reason why this is stopping and this is not provoking something really dramatic, is the fact that at a certain point, people are just fed up listening to the repetition of this information and they don't want to hear about it. But if people don't want to hear about it, they are still ready to talk about it. So it's the absence of listener, which is really the important aspect in inhibition of this process. So here is an example of the result of such a fantastic mutual reactivation of emotion, which is bringing something like a collective hysteria. This is really nonsense, but it was produced. So that's millions of flowers. So the first person who has been observing the sharing of emotion in the collective process, it's Pennebaker and with the colleague I mentioned earlier, who was a student of James Pennebaker in the United States. And in 1993, they published a paper observing the evolution of the social sharing and the thought for two different important emotional episodes at that time in the United States. First, the starting of the first Gulf War, which has been eliciting a lot of emotion in the American population, and at about the same time, an earthquake in California. And they observed that during a period of 3 months, you have at the start very abundant thought and sharing going on, and then you get an extinction, and after 3 months, virtually the process is extinguished. And they've been proposing a model of what's going on during the first month, which is the period of high activation, where you get abundant thought, abundant talks, very important media coverage, and process of social integration, because in this context, people do develop fantastic prosocial behavior. That's the time of the generosity, where people are ready to donate money, like we probably all did at some occasion. So there is very high, very intensive social activity. Then the second month is a period of plateau, where things are stabilizing, abundant thought, but talks fade away because of the process I mentioned. Media coverage disappears, media coverage is short-ranged. And then social integration still remains. And then there is extinction after the second month. Thought fade away, social linkage and prosociality vanish totally, and there is a return to normal life. With my colleague Dario Paes, I'm going to mention again later, we observed, we wanted to test this model, and we collected data on an 8-week period immediately after the terrorist attack happened in Madrid station in 2004. And here is the evolution of talking, of hearing, and of thinking during this 8-week period. And you can see that this is clearly confirming Pennebaker's model. So that's for the proportion of people who did share, and that's for the frequency of talking, of hearing, of thinking. So it gives reality to the proposed model. And then it was predicted that if there is intensive sharing initially, then it should be predictive of a number of parameters of a social life 8 weeks later. And so 8 weeks later, we recontacted participants, and for a part of them, we could obtain their rating of a number of psychosocial scale: positive affect, loneliness, perceived social support, perceived solidarity, and cohesion. And we got significant correlation. There is not much high, because there is a lot of noise, of course, in this population, where respondents were of all ages, of all parts of Spain, of all type of profession, and so on and so on. But still, we observe a predictability from the extent of sharing initially. 8 weeks later, the level of positive affect, the level of loneliness, people feel less lonely the more they've been sharing initially, the perceived social support, the more they've been sharing, the more they perceive that they are socially supported in the population, and the more they rate the population as manifesting solidarity and cohesion, which is supporting the view Pennebaker proposed about the development of prosociality during these exchanges. And finally, something about collective gatherings, which is nowadays my most important research topic. Collective emotional gathering, it's when people experience together an emotion. And I'm taking the sport event, which has been mentioned earlier by Professor Holyst. Sport event as something which is really emblematic of emotion experience collectively. Here is what develops when a winning situation happens. The winner is first manifesting something which is a bit bizarre. The first manifestation, first facial expression, is something which is close to aggressiveness. It's a situation of invigoration, probably the remain of the effort the person has been investing in the minute before just to reach this stage where you win the situation. The second behavior is expansion visibility, the fact that I'm showing myself. Expansion probably also because inside of myself, I have a fantastic boom of the ego because of this experience of winning. But also it allows people to see that I am the winner and not the guy besides me, so visibility. And then immediately after, sociability. You can see the winners attracting the interest of the audience with stimulating their social behavior. And what's going on after can be like this, with the crowd invading the stadium, and then probably the emblematic example of what happened in Paris when French people won the Soccer World Cup in 1980 with 1 million people on the Champs-Élysées celebrating together. So you can see that it's bringing some important level of social integration. Then in 1912, there was a fantastic model proposed for accounting for such situation. It's in his book on religion, Emil Durkheim wanted to account for the fact that in every important religion, there is a meeting of people every week. And so there is a very important gathering, which is probably not obvious in all religions today, but often emotional. And he wanted to account for this fact, and his idea was that in religious ritual, you have this periodic gathering of individuals because in the presence of the group symbols, they develop their homogeneous movement. They would have fusion, communion through words. They pronounce the same word. They shout the same shout together. They develop same gestures. They sing together, and so on, so that they would mutually reinforce their emotion. This would develop a climate of reciprocal empathy and emotional contagion, and this would bring people in a state of fusion between themselves and to the group. And so that would be refreshing their attachment to the religion to which they would be linked. We are a number of people believing that this model is valid for any type of collective gathering, any type, whatever it would be. Would it be religious ritual, commemoration, celebration, feast, demonstration, political demonstration, whatever. And here is a schematic view of the model proposed by Emil Durkheim. The first idea, the key of the process, it's emotional effect, the sharing of emotion. Because in this situation, you necessarily have this reciprocal stimulation of emotion with the reaching of a stage of emotional communion and feeling of unity. Because of this, this is going to have a big influence on social variables. Social variables, it's group belonging. You would get an effect of enhancement of the social integration of participants, and at the same time, a strengthening of the beliefs which are shared by the group. And once you get this, you can get a number of individual effects due to social integration plus enhancements of collective belief. People can leave this collective situation, go back to their activity alone in their personal situation. They would experience for some time trust in life, strength, and self-confidence. And so it can go on for some time. The strange thing is that in 100 years, a century, there was not a single empirical attempt to verify this model. And together with my colleague Dario Paez, who is working at the University of San Sebastian in Spain, we decided to develop research on it. Since now some 10 years, we are collecting data in a variety of situations like religious ceremonies, family celebration, folkloric marches in Belgium, concert and chorus, protest demonstration in Spain in 2 different cases, recently with the Indian demonstration in Madrid, Gachacha Truth and Reconciliation in Rwanda, commemoration of massacres in Guatemala, and finally even experimental induction of protest demonstrations. So we create laboratory situation where people had to protest. And I cannot go through this, part of this material has already been published. The main finding can be summed in this manner. First, when people participate to this situation, they experience enhanced emotional arousal, which means that participate to such a situation which would in no manner evacuate your emotion. To the contrary, it's really enhancing emotion. The second effect is enhanced social integration. The third effect, consolidation of relevant beliefs. And the fourth effect on a number of individual variables, which means that all in all, we do support with our data this Durkheimian model which is really a very, very rich, very precious one. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Questions, comments? I have a comment about this last slide. This is enormous origin of enormous power, which is in state and many organizations are involved in this.
Yeah. You just have to go back to the picture of the Nazi regime and see what was going. Those guys, they understood what was going on. They really had the command, the mastery of this process. And there's some indication that Hitler had been reading some of the influential authors and maybe also Durkheim. So he knew how to manipulate this.
Do you think we can observe secondary social sharing also in the internet?
Of course, I think all the time. I think that's probably what you are doing. When I heard what Professor, that's all the time, that's social sharing of emotion. Yeah.
As many of the initial examples you gave, like childbirth and bereavement and so forth, it seems that you started at least there, and also talking about the consequences then of the model that this type of social sharing has, with very intense, unambiguous, primary emotions that are then shared. In some of Cyberemotions we also have that. In other parts of data that we looked at, we also delved a little bit into more things like opinions, evaluations, judgments about videos, political discussions, where it's not necessarily in all of the data immediately clear what the shared emotion is, but people are really having a discussion and exchanging different views. To what extent do you think that this model of social sharing can be transferred to situations like that? Would that have the same consequences when you have such an emotional discussion about opinions that you have and other people may or may not share, as opposed to talking about childbirth or bereavement?
Yeah. It's not the case that because I took that example because it's illustrative in a longitudinal way. It's good data, I would say, but we have got billions of observations about we use a technique which is it's very cheap. It's asking people to retrieve from their memory a recent emotional episode of a certain kind, and then we can decide what kind of episode. So we've been really exploring all types of episodes, and the social sharing of emotion is always observed, except when in the emotion rated by the person, you have something like guilt or shame and so on and so on. Which means that, the relationship between emotion and social sharing, in my view, there is no doubt about that. It's really all range. Now, you mentioned case where people have discussion. Of course, we do not talk in life only when we have emotion. We talk for a variety of reasons. The idea behind the social sharing of emotion, it's the idea that you do not have an emotion without experiencing some discrepancy. And this discrepancy might sometimes elicit only low intensity feelings, but there is still a discrepancy, and the discrepancy might finally be the most important explanation behind the process. So that might be one way to extend the model to the type of situation you describe. So more research about discrepant situation might be needed.
Yes. One word that came up already in the definition of the Cyberemotions Project was collective emotions in cyberspace. And in your presentation, you had collective emotions, you had collective cyber emotions, and your model very much is based, the last one, on collective emotions, which you defined two features, if I synthesize. One is that a group of people was affected by a particular event, rather than what you described before, where a single event spreads over a network. And the second is that everything happens at that time. There is a concurrence that happens. So this is now. An event happens. Now, in cyberspace, some of the things that we looked at would happen in a very short time frame, but others might be over days, weeks, where you go to a forum, you stumble in a forum, and people are writing about whether there is a God or not. And you read 5 of these things, and you think, who are these idiots? And you reply. At that point, there is no physical concurrent. There might be a psychological concurrent that you create as you read these things. Now, to what degree do you think, from your point of view, from your model, there's a categorical distinction between these events that happen at the same time versus those stretched out over time? Or would you believe that this is like a dimension where simply the more concurrent, the more condensed they are on a temporal space, the more these effects will happen?
I would take the second solution, clearly. Yeah. I didn't consider this in my research, but now that you open the way to that perspective, I would take that one. Yeah. The psychological concurrence is the essential factor for determining what's going on.